The air was warm that evening, with a soft golden light spreading across the wide open land. The Arizona plains were quiet, except for the sound of a few horses moving slowly near the fence. The sun was beginning to set, and the sky was painted in shades of orange, pink, and gold. A young man named Thomas Brigham stood near the edge of the corral, looking out toward the ridge. He had been working on the ranch for years. He knew the land well, the soft dirt paths, the smell of the dry grass, and the way the wind moved across the fields like a whisper. It was supposed to be a simple evening. One of the horses had wandered a little farther away than usual, and the reins were still looped around a wooden fence post near the ridge. Thomas had done this job 100 times. He just needed to ride out, unloop the reins, and lead the horse back. He wasn't expecting anything unusual. There was no reason to hurry. He took a deep breath, picked up his hat, and swung it lightly against his leg as he walked toward the stable. The horses inside shifted their weight and snorted softly. They knew Thomas well. He moved gently around them, never raising his voice, never rushing them. He saddled his brown horse, Dusty, and whispered softly to calm him down. Dusty responded with a light shake of his head, as if agreeing to the evening ride. Within minutes, Thomas mounted the saddle and the two of them began to move toward the open land. The sound of Dusty's hooves against the dry ground was slow and steady. The breeze touched Thomas's face as they rode toward the ridge. He loved this time of day, when the sky changed colors and everything felt quiet. Even the crickets had not yet begun their evening songs. There was something peaceful about moments like this. For a brief time, it felt as if the world belonged to no one, and no one had to rush. Thomas thought about the long day he had spent fixing fences and carrying feed. It was tiring work, but he liked it. He liked knowing exactly what needed to be done. There was no confusion in his world, no loud noise, just honest work and open skies. He adjusted the brim of his hat and clicked his tongue gently to encourage Dusty forward. They moved past the tall grasses, the wooden posts, and the old windmill that creaked softly in the breeze. As they got closer to the ridge, Thomas noticed something odd. The horses usually stayed close, but this time, the one he was looking for had gone farther than expected. It wasn't a big problem, but it made him curious. He leaned forward slightly, squinting his eyes against the bright orange light of the setting sun. He could see the fence post from a distance. The reins were still looped there. Everything seemed normal. But then, something moved near the edge of the mesquite trees. It was just a flicker at first, a shadow or a shape that didn't belong to the stillness of the land. Thomas slowed Dusty down. His heart didn't race, but it did tighten just a little. He wasn't afraid. He was curious. Living on the land meant you noticed small things. A moving shadow could mean many things: a bird, a coyote, or maybe even another rider. He guided Dusty closer but kept his movements quiet. The air around the ridge felt different, heavier like the way the world feels right before rain. The sound of the wind seemed to fade away. All he could hear was the soft rhythm of Dusty's hooves and his own breathing. When he got close enough, he saw something he didn't expect at all. From behind one of the mesquite trees, a young woman stepped out. She wasn't one of the ranch workers. She wasn't someone Thomas recognized. She was dressed in clothes that told him she was from the Apache community that lived beyond the hills. Her hair was long and dark, flowing loosely down her back. She looked tired, very tired. Her steps were unsteady, as if each one cost her all the strength she had left. Her face was pale under the warm light, and she kept one hand close to her side. Thomas froze in place. He didn't move closer right away. He just watched her for a moment. She wasn't holding anything. She wasn't making any sudden moves. She simply looked like someone who had walked too far under the hot sun and had finally reached the end of her strength. For a brief second, their eyes met. She looked at him, not with anger, not with fear, but with something softer. It was the look of someone asking for help without using words. He gently patted Dusty's neck and whispered, "Easy, boy." Then he slowly got down from the saddle. He didn't want to startle her. He kept his hands where she could see them. The distance between them was not too big, but it felt delicate. like a thin thread that could break with the wrong move. Thomas had grown up hearing many stories about the Apache people. Some were kind, some were not. But stories were just stories. Now there was a real person standing in front of him, someone who was clearly in trouble. Her clothes were dusty. Her lips looked dry. She was swaying on her feet as if the ground itself was shifting under her. Thomas didn't know what had happened to her, but he could tell she needed help. The wind moved softly through the grass, and a bird flew past them, breaking the silence for just a moment. Thomas slowly took a step forward, careful not to make any sudden noise. The woman didn't step back. She just stood there, breathing slowly, watching him. She looked young, maybe not much younger than him. There was something strong in the way she stood, even though she was clearly weak. Thomas reached into his saddlebag and took out a small leather canteen of water. He held it up so she could see it clearly, then slowly placed it on a flat rock halfway between them. He stepped back to give her space. She looked at the canteen, then at him again, unsure for a moment. Finally, she took a step forward. Her movements were slow, almost careful, like someone who hadn't felt safe in a long time. When she reached the canteen, she picked it up with both hands. She tilted it gently and drank, not too fast, as if each sip needed to be savored. Thomas felt something shift inside him as he watched her. She wasn't just a stranger anymore. She was someone real, someone who had been through something she didn't have the words to explain yet. After a moment, she looked up again, her eyes meeting his. She didn't say thank you out loud, but she didn't need to. He saw it in her face. Thomas didn't ask any questions. He didn't demand to know where she came from or why she was there. He simply nodded once, slowly, letting her know she was safe for now. The horse that Thomas had come for stood quietly near the fence post, almost forgotten. The simple task he had come to do, unloop the reins, had now become something far bigger. He walked closer to the woman, this time slowly enough that she could see every step. When he was near enough, he saw that she was shivering a little, even though the evening was still warm. It wasn't from the cold, it was from exhaustion. Thomas didn't speak much, but his actions spoke for him. He took his light jacket off and gently placed it around her shoulders without touching her directly. She didn't resist. She just let the fabric fall softly over her. For the first time since he had seen her, she closed her eyes briefly, as if the simple kindness had given her a small piece of peace. He knew he couldn't just leave her there. She wouldn't make it through the night alone in the open land. But he also knew bringing her back to the settlement would not be simple. People talked. People had opinions. Yet, standing there, looking at this young woman who had no strength left to keep walking, Thomas felt something stronger than fear of gossip. He felt responsibility. Dusty let out a soft breath and the sky grew darker. The stars were starting to appear one by one, above the ridge. Thomas gently guided the woman toward the horse, making sure she didn't have to walk too fast. At first, she hesitated, looking at the saddle like it was a challenge too big to face. But Thomas didn't rush her. He spoke softly, not in her language, but in the language of kindness, steady, calm, and patient. Eventually, she allowed him to help her onto Dusty's back. She sat there lightly, her hands resting on the saddle horn. Thomas could tell she was still weak, but she was no longer alone. He picked up the reins from the fence post, the simple task he had come for, and held them loosely in one hand. With his other hand, he gently held the horse's bridle and started walking back toward the ranch. As they moved slowly through the night air, Thomas could hear the sound of crickets now, singing their songs to the stars. The world felt different from when he had left. He had gone out expecting an ordinary evening, a quiet ride, a simple task, nothing more. But life had a way of surprising people when they least expected it. He glanced up at the sky again, watching the stars spread like a soft blanket above them. The woman sat silently behind him on the horse. She didn't speak, and neither did he. But something passed between them in that silence, a quiet trust, a fragile bond born out of kindness. The ranch was still a little far, but Thomas didn't mind the slow pace. For the first time in a long while, He felt like he was part of something bigger than just fences, rains, and long days. He didn't know her story yet, but he knew that tonight their paths had crossed for a reason. And just like that, a simple evening ride to Unloop the Reins became the beginning of something neither of them could have planned. The night had fully arrived by the time Thomas and the young Apache woman neared the edge of the ranch. The moon was climbing higher in the sky, casting a silver light over the fields. The world around them felt quieter than usual, as if even the crickets had softened their songs to listen to the soft steps of Dusty's hooves. The woman sat quietly behind Thomas, her hands resting lightly on the saddle. She hadn't spoken a word during the journey, but her breathing had become more even. She was no longer trembling. The gentle rhythm of the ride had slowly eased the weight she carried on her shoulders. Thomas felt the cool night air on his face as he led the horse carefully down the familiar path. He glanced over his shoulder every now and then, just to be sure she was all right. Her eyes were half closed, tired but calm. She was safe now, or at least safer than she had been alone out there in the dark. The ranch came into view, its small cluster of warm lights glowing softly like stars fallen to the ground. It wasn't a big place, just a few wooden buildings, some fences, and the corral. But to Thomas, it was home. He had grown up around people who worked hard, spoke little, and believed in quiet acts more than loud words. He didn't know how everyone would react to his unexpected arrival tonight. But he also knew in his heart that he couldn't have done anything differently. As Dusty walked into the open space in front of the barn, a few of the workers turned their heads. They had been sitting around the fire, talking in low voices, not expecting any surprises. But their conversation stopped when they saw Thomas riding in with someone behind him. One of them stood up, shading his eyes against the firelight to get a better look. Thomas helped the woman down carefully. Her legs were unsteady when they touched the ground. He kept a respectful distance but stayed close enough in case she needed support. She wrapped his jacket tighter around her shoulders, not out of fear but as if the fabric itself carried warmth and safety. "Evening," one of the men by the fire called out. His voice unsure, Thomas didn't explain right away. He simply nodded and gently guided her toward the barn where it was warmer. The others didn't move closer. They just watched, whispering softly to one another, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. No one had expected Thomas to return with a stranger, especially a young Apache woman. Inside the barn, it smelled of hay and leather, familiar and comforting. Thomas helped her sit on a wooden bench near the wall. She sat slowly, her body still weak but her eyes more alert now. Thomas went to the corner where a water bucket and clean cloth were kept. He brought them back without a word. When he handed her the damp cloth, she accepted it carefully and touched it to her face, as if feeling water on her skin brought her a small piece of the world back. Thomas wasn't sure how to speak to her. They didn't share the same language, but kindness didn't need translation. He pointed to the water bucket and she nodded lightly. He gave her a small cup and she drank slowly. Every sip seemed to help her sit a little straighter, breathe a little easier. Not long after, the ranch owner, Mr. Allen, appeared in the doorway. He was an older man with a calm face and eyes that missed nothing. He didn't raise his voice or rush forward. He simply stood for a moment, taking in the quiet scene in front of him. Thomas, the tired young woman, and the horse still standing patiently outside. "Thomas," he said softly, "what happened out there?" Thomas turned toward him. "I went to get the horse like I was supposed to," he answered carefully. "But I found her near the ridge. She was alone and tired. She couldn't have made it through the night on her own. So I brought her here." Mr. Allen didn't speak for a moment. He looked at the woman, then back at Thomas. His face didn't show judgment, only thought. He slowly walked closer, careful not to frighten her. She lifted her eyes to him but didn't step back. She just sat quietly, watching both men with calm curiosity. "We'll give her water and a place to rest," Mr. Allen said finally. His voice was steady, not questioning the decision. "We can talk in the morning." Thomas nodded with quiet relief. Together they prepared a small space in the barn loft where it was warm and dry. They gave her a blanket and a pillow. She didn't speak, but when she lay down, the tension in her shoulders slowly melted away. Before Thomas left the barn, she looked up at him for a moment. There was a softness in her eyes, a silent thank you that didn't need words. He gave her a small nod and stepped out into the cool night. Outside, the men around the fire were still whispering. Some of them were curious, some unsure, but none said anything directly to Thomas. He untied Dusty, patted him gently, and led him back to the stable. As he brushed the horse's mane, he thought about the strange turn the evening had taken. He had expected to come back alone. Instead, his choice had brought someone new into their world. When Thomas finally went to bed, the moon was high. He lay on his back, staring at the wooden ceiling, thinking about her face, the tired eyes, the quiet strength. He didn't know who she was or where she had come from, but something told him this moment would not be forgotten easily. The next morning came softly, with golden light streaming through the cracks in the barn walls. The air smelled fresh the way it does after a cool night. Thomas got up early, as he always did, and went to check on her. When he climbed the steps to the loft, he found her sitting up, wrapped in the blanket, looking out at the morning light through the small window. She seemed stronger, her breathing steady, her expression thoughtful. She turned when she heard him and gave a small nod, a quiet greeting. He returned the nod with a gentle smile. He offered her a piece of bread and some warm milk, and she accepted. As she ate slowly, he could see the color returning to her cheeks. She was beginning to look less like someone lost in the dark and more like someone finding her way back to herself. Later that day, Mr. Allen gathered a few trusted people and spoke with Thomas. They agreed she could stay until she was ready to leave. They didn't ask her to explain anything right away. They understood that some stories were too heavy to tell the moment they began. Over the next few days, the woman, whose name they learned was Ayanna, became a quiet part of their routine. She didn't speak their language, but she watched carefully and learned fast. She helped carry water, sweep the barn floor, and feed the horses. She moved with calm grace, like someone who belonged to the land. The workers, who had first whispered uncertainly, slowly grew used to seeing her each day. Some even began to smile at her when she passed. Thomas watched all this quietly. He didn't try to lead her or control her. He simply made sure she had what she needed and gave her space to breathe. In the evenings, they often sat outside near the corral, not speaking much but sharing the quiet. Sometimes she would hum a soft tune, something gentle that carried across the breeze. It made the place feel warmer, as if a new kind of peace had come with her. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky gold, Thomas sat beside the fence with a small cup of coffee. Ayanna sat a few steps away, weaving a small string of grass between her fingers. She looked at the sky, then at him, and for the first time she said his name softly. Thomas, it was a simple moment, but it felt like something important. A bridge had been built, not through many words, but through kindness, trust, and time. Thomas smiled, surprised but deeply moved. He didn't need to say much back. He simply said, Ayanna. Her name sounded warm in the evening air. In the weeks that followed, the story of how Thomas had found her became part of the ranch's quiet history. It wasn't told with loud voices or dramatic gestures, but in soft words by the fire. People didn't talk about it with fear anymore. They talked about it as a reminder that sometimes one small act can change more than anyone expects. Ayanna chose to stay near the ranch for a while. She built her own small space nearby where she could be close to the land she loved. She would sometimes disappear into the hills for a day or two, then return with herbs, seeds, or stories she shared through quiet gestures. She and Thomas never needed many words. They had a language built on respect and shared silence. Thomas often thought back to that evening at the ridge. How ordinary it had seemed at first. How quickly everything had changed. He had only gone out to unloop the reins, something he'd done countless times before. But life has a way of placing unexpected turns on ordinary paths. That night had brought him face to face with someone who would change his way of seeing the world. Years later, people would still remember how Ayanna came to the ranch, not as a stranger, but as someone carried back gently in the arms of a young man who simply followed his heart. Her presence became a quiet thread woven into the fabric of their lives, reminding them that kindness can be stronger than fear, and that sometimes the simplest choices become the most unforgettable stories. And Thomas, every time he walked out to the ridge at sunset, would remember that single moment when a simple task turned into something much greater. A moment when a quiet act of care became the start of a story no one would ever forget.